Well, good afternoon. Excuse me. I am Pablo Arenas, president of Texas A&M International University, and I have one job today, and that's to welcome you to this conference. And I do that enthusiastically. This is a great conference. I've been here, this is my 16th year here, 17th year, somewhere there, and this was well established when I came in 2008. So it's been a long time that we've had this conference. It brings together people from across across the country, across the world, and different perspectives. And it's a great conference for us to be able to understand business and business in the Western Hemisphere, business in the U.S. and Mexico, and just really to get together and discuss things. I've looked at some of the sessions this morning, look really great, and it looks like the sessions this afternoon are going to be even better. Those of you who had the opportunity to come to the opening session last night, I got to hear a terrific discussion on the Phoenix economy. And I was wondering, Phoenix economy, what, and then about halfway through, it clicked, Phoenix rising from the ashes. And so that's what he talked about, was really the economy rising from the ashes of COVID. It was a great talk, and I'm looking forward to today's speech, a talk also on Mexico and the next president and the elections in Mexico, because the elections in Mexico, not only the election in the United States, but the election in Mexico has a huge impact on Laredo and this region. And so again, welcome everybody. I thank you for coming, and I know you've had a great morning. I know you have a great afternoon, and I know you'll have a great day tomorrow talking about this region and what can happen. And I think I will turn it over now to George Clark.
So my job is also simple. I just need to introduce the speaker, so I don't want to, but I do have a couple of things first. So first I want to welcome you as well. My name's George Clark. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Western Hemispheric Trade in TAMIU's A.R. Sanchez School of Business. But before introducing the speaker, I would like to thank our sponsors of this event, which is IBC Bank and Commerce Bank. Their support for this conference and for the IBC Commerce Bank Speaker Series has allowed us to bring many thought-provoking speakers to TAMIU and Laredo over the years. So thank you for that. Following the talk, there'll be a question and answer session. We'll take questions from the audience in attendance here, and we also have an online audience. And so if you're in the audience in the question here, put up your hand and somebody will bring you a microphone. It's important you talk into the microphone because we want the speaker to hear you, and we also want our online audience to hear your question as well. If you're online, what you need to do is you need to type your question into the Q&A session, and then we will relay it to the speaker at an opportune time. So we want to encourage as many questions as possible. So Andrew Rudman is a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center and the former director of its Mexico Institute. Before joining the Wilson Center, Mr. Rudman was a managing director at Monarch Global Strategies, a boutique strategy advisory firm located in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining Monarch, Mr. Rudman was deputy vice president of the Western Hemisphere at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. He began his professional career with the U.S. government and served in the Department of State as a tenured Foreign Service officer, and in the Department of Commerce, where he was the director of the Office of NAFTA and Inter-American Affairs. So his presentation today is entitled Mexico's Next President, Challenges and Recommendation. Let's welcome Mr. Rudman.
Okay, did I do that? I think I did that correctly. You can all hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Dr. Clark. Thank you, IBC Bank, my friend Jerry Schwebel, and thanks to all of you for being here today and for inviting me to join you for your 28th annual conference. I think any event that occurs year after year is important. I'm a big fan of seeing events occur over and over. We do several events at the Wilson Center each year that we've done on an annual basis. I think it's really important to maintain that conversation and sort of create the focus that comes from sort of knowing there's always an event of a given topic. So thank you for the opportunity, and thanks also for the opportunity to be outside of the Washington, D.C. Beltway. You know, it sounds like a cliche, but the truth is, getting out from outside the Beltway, talking to people who buy and sell and hire and fire and really live the border economy and live the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico is a great opportunity for me. I always learn a lot talking to all of you, so I'm looking forward to the questions and some discussion that will follow and perhaps even throughout the afternoon. So I'm going to just make sure I'm sort of keeping track of how long I'm talking, because as many of you know, when you start talking about Mexico and the U.S. and trade, you can go on for a long time, and I don't want to do that because I do want to leave time for questions. So what I'm going to do is talk, as Dr. Clark said, about what is coming, what is the meaning behind the upcoming Mexican election, and then how that ties into nearshoring, which is one of the chapter that I wrote in our publication, Mexico's Next President, which we released back last November. So to start, I think it's important to remember sort of how we got here. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, the president of Mexico, was elected in 2018 with an overwhelming majority of votes. There is no re-election in Mexico, so he cannot run for re-election. It's one term only. Every 12 years, our election cycle and Mexico's election cycle coincide. This is one of those years, so as was mentioned, this is a big deal. 2024 is a big year. So AMLO won, and what he promised to do when he was running was inaugurate what he calls the fourth transformation, or the Cuatro T, which really in many ways is you could think of it as make Mexico great again, or you could think of it as sort of a return to the 1970s when you had a much more dynamic Pemex, the state oil company. You had a much more state interventionist economy than what had occurred particularly over, say, the last 30 years, which of course coincides with NAFTA. So the election is really a question of the fourth transformation or a return to a more neoliberal model, a more typical, more heavily dependent on the private sector for generating wealth, which Mexico had up until 2018. It's also important to keep in mind that AMLO is incredibly popular. Now, well into the fifth year of a six-year term, his popularity is still over 50%. It's about 54%, which, you know, we think about the popularity of leaders in our country, 54 is pretty good, and it has at times been higher. And again, if you look at different polls, you of course get different numbers. Part of what AMLO did over his term is create a number of social programs of wealth transfers, mostly direct cash transfers from the government to individuals. He increased access to pensions. He created a program for youths between 19 and 29 who were neither studying nor working. He created Sembrando Vida, which is a cash transfer program to encourage planting of trees, particularly in the southern part of Mexico. And all of those things, all of those combined mean that more than 50% of Mexicans get some sort of direct transfer from the government. And that is and will continue to have an impact on the campaign. So there are three main candidates running for president. Claudia Sheinbaum, the former head of government of Mexico City, or the mayor, if you want to think of it in those terms, is AMLO's chosen successor. And she is way ahead of the polls, in part because of what I just mentioned, because there are so many people who are tangibly getting something from the government. And one of the complaints that helped AMLO win was the argument that the government isn't really doing anything for you. So why don't you change, vote for me because I'll make it different. And that was the promise he made. So Claudia Sheinbaum is a trained physicist. She's was very active on climate change issues. She was a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that won the Nobel Prize. So definitely a scientific background, a scientist's background, if you will. She's running against Xochitl Gálvez, who is the candidate for the traditional parties in Mexico, the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD. Xochitl is a self-made person. She grew up selling gum in the streets to help support her family. She wound up getting a scholarship to go to school at UNAM in Mexico City. Ultimately started her own business in the IT sector, supporting smart buildings. So really a self-made person, indigenous roots. In some ways, based on background, it seems like she's the one who should be AMLO's choice, at least based on background, not based on her policy prescription. And then you have Jorge Alvarez Maínez from the Movimiento Ciudadano, which is a small party that fashions itself as neither Morena nor the traditional parties. Alvarez Maínez is polling somewhere around 7%. It is significant, and as you may be aware, the Movimiento Ciudadano has the governorships in Jalisco and Nuevo León, so it's not an irrelevant party, but for the purposes of this conversation and the election, it's really a question of Claudia or Xochitl. Claudia is way ahead, as I mentioned. There's a recent poll in El Financiero, which is thought to be a pretty solid poll, which gives her about a 17-point lead. I've seen, as close as 8%. I've seen as far as 30%. I think the specific numbers aren't that important. What's important is that Claudia is ahead. She's running very much an incumbent campaign, even though she's not the incumbent. She's being very careful in what she says. She's taken some criticism for not meeting with different business groups to really talk about what she plans to do. And if you think about politics in general, she's running like all she has to do is not screw up. And so far that's working. As you can see, the polling has been pretty consistent. Even though the campaign legally started on March 1st, we've known who the candidates would be since last September, and they've basically been running even though legally they can't say anything. So while Claudia will benefit from AMLO's popularity and his coattails and his use of his morning press conference to talk each day about all the great things he has done and suggest all the things the opposition will do terribly if they win, Xochitl's one of her biggest challenges really is the image of the traditional parties. So you can see there the top line is Morena, AMLO's party. The bottom three lines are the traditional parties, and you can see public opinion. We did a program at the Wilson Center back in January, sort of a kickoff of 2024's election conversations. And one of our panelists observed that if the election came down to person versus person, that Xochitl maybe would be competitive. But to the extent the campaign was one of which party or which coalition do you like, Xochitl would be in trouble. And I think what we've seen so far echoes that she's not making up ground because the parties that she represents, and I'll caveat that by saying Xochitl herself says she is representing them. She does not belong to the PAN. She currently holds a seat in the Senate for the PAN, but even in the presidential debate the other night, she kept insisting that I'm running for them, but I'm not of them. And that, I think, tells you a lot about where she is. So let me talk a little bit with that as sort of context of what was it we tried to do in the book. I'm sorry, I don't know how well you can see that slide. But what we tried to do with the book that we published in November is lay out some of the issues that we thought the next Mexican president would face. That's not all the issues. Even looking at the list, I bet you're all thinking, why didn't you include fill in the blank? The reason was we were trying to keep it fairly short. It's about a 60-page booklet. It's available on the Mexico Institute webpage in English or Spanish. But what we tried to do, that's probably better for everybody. What we tried to do is highlight the issues that are really important and issues where there's some overlap to the United States, where cooperation with the United States would be beneficial, if not essential. And, on things like migration and security and USMCA, obviously essential, and for the other issues, really helpful. And the goal was not to sort of tell the next president what to do. You know, who are we sitting in Washington to tell the next president what to do, but to try to outline the challenges that they would face, whoever would win, that, you know, when you take office on October 1st, that here's how it's going to be, and these are some things you might consider doing to try to address the situation you're going to inherit. So that was really the concept behind the book, which we presented, as I said, last November. And I'm going to talk mostly now about nearshoring, which is the chapter that I wrote and worked on. But you'll see that there's a lot of overlap between that chapter and the other chapters. In fact, in the introduction when we launched the book, I talked about how there was an awful lot of interconnectedness. You're going to hear me talk about many of the topics that I showed on that list of chapters. You know, the reality is, if you don't have security, you're not going to have a good investment climate for nearshoring. If you don't comply with the trade agreement, you're not going to have a good investment climate. If you don't solve migration, et cetera. So a lot of interconnectedness. So nearshoring, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the term, I found what I think is a good definition: the transferring of business operation to a nearby country, especially in preference to a more distant one. So basically, it's bringing jobs back, to use the sort of popular way to describe it. Often people use the terms nearshoring, friendshoring, and ally shoring. There are distinctions in the definitions, but in my mind, it's really all the same thing. It's not producing as much in China and moving the production, the locus of production, to somewhere else. So friendshoring would be a country that isn't close to the US, but with whom we have a stronger relationship. So you could think about maybe Korea or Australia or Chile. Friendshoring is what, or friendshoring would be countries like that aren't necessarily on our border. Nearshoring is Mexico. Ally shoring, at least in my mind, is a country with whom we actually have an alliance, a security relationship. So Canada, ally, Mexico, really important friend and partner, but technically not an ally because we don't have a security guarantee with Mexico. But that's sort of semantics. I think what's important is why is this happening? One reason is China. It's the competition with China. If you'll recall, when President Trump was running for office, he focused very much on the trade deficit with China and sought to reverse that by imposing pretty high tariffs on imports of Chinese goods. The Biden administration really hasn't changed that, so we still have high tariffs on direct imports from China. The second reason that drove nearshoring was COVID-19. I think it showed us, first of all, the danger of relying on China and Asia on production from so far away, because if you'll all recall, there were big backups at ports, at the port of Long Beach, for example, of ships coming from Asia. There were delays in what could come across the border. There were shortages, and you probably all remember there were times when, you know, you couldn't find toilet paper, you couldn't find this or that. And so I think that taught us that, okay, we need to really sort of have a better understanding of where we get stuff from and how do we make sure that we're not overly reliant. And I think that reliance, so that third point of supply chain resilience, I think what we also learned is if you have only one supplier, whether that supplier is across the street or halfway around the world, then you're at risk. You're putting all your marbles in one basket. And so I think there's been a sense of realizing that that you can't do trade on a just-in-time basis. You have to think more about just-in-case. What happens if the border is shut down between the U.S. and Mexico? Or what happens if a ship goes sideways in the Suez Canal and blocks the canal for X months, which, if you recall, did in fact happen. So those were all the drivers to look at, okay, how do we change where we do production? How do we find alternatives? And this is where Mexico has a great opportunity because of its location, because of USMCA, the successor to NAFTA, because of Mexico's human capital, because of the experience. I mean, there's a long list of reasons why Mexico has opportunities. And so the question, the sort of premise of all of this is what has happened so far a bubble, or is it something that can be sustained? Can Mexico continue to attract investment that will allow it to create job growth, economic growth, which among other things, would tie back to migration, right? If people have more opportunities at home, they tend to not migrate. So all of these things are connected. So Mexico in 2023 had record levels of foreign direct investment, $36 billion, which is great. UNCTAD had projected $45 billion, so they didn't quite meet what was predicted. And perhaps more importantly, two things that are maybe more important. One is that about 75% of the investment happened in the first half of 2023. And of the entire $36 billion, about 75% was reinvestment of profits. And that's not a bad thing at all. It means companies that are operating in Mexico saw opportunities to expand a warehouse or add a shift or something like that. That's not a bad thing. But what it tells you is you're not seeing brand new entrants into the market. You're seeing expansion of existing. So that's one of the concerns that that the next government should think about is, okay, how do we get new people to come? So there are 4 areas that, sorry, let me skip one thing. So let me just quickly, so the AMLO government didn't really do much to attract investment, which is why I skipped the point that it's in spite of, not because of. AMLO didn't really create an environment, a sense that Mexico was welcoming of foreign investment, particularly in the energy sector, but not at all exclusive to the energy sector. Only last October of 23, so 5 years into his term, did the government introduce some tax incentives to allow for accelerated depreciation and a little bit of credit for workforce development in 10 particular sectors. And there are sectors that you would imagine: semiconductors, electronics, engines, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, for export. So all of this sort of advanced manufacturing opportunities. So, okay. So 4 areas basically that are critical to attracting nearshoring. And I would say these are really 4 areas that are critical to attracting investment and promoting economic development, regardless of where you are and regardless of whether you want that investment to come from halfway around the world or from across the street. The point is that if you create a positive economic environment, a place where there's dependability and certainty, you're gonna create jobs. And there'll be jobs for small business, there'll be jobs for exports, there'll be jobs for local consumption. So workforce development, and here we're talking about things like upskilling and reskilling of workers, particularly lower wage workers, because those are the jobs that are going to disappear through the use of AI, through robotics, et cetera. Companies are going to find, we were chatting about this at just a moment ago at lunch, that if you build a factory now, you're going to build a lot of robots, and you're going to need somebody who knows how to program those or how to service those, but you're not necessarily going to need anybody who knows how to put pieces together, because that's what the robots or the AI will do. There's also a lack of skilled labor in our country, let alone in Mexico or anywhere else. Just recently I saw that TMSC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Company, which is building a huge semiconductor fab in Arizona, had to delay the project because they can't find enough skilled workers. So if we can't find it here, you can imagine it's going to be hard to find it elsewhere. And another challenge that companies often have, maybe some in this room, but certainly many that I've talked to have said, well, you know, we have all these graduates and they come out with an engineering degree, but they really don't know how to do the thing we need them to do, and we have to spend a lot of time training them. And then the concern is that, you know, if I hire someone and I invest in training them, and then they get a better job offer somewhere else, or, you know, maybe it's the same job, but it pays a few dollars more, they're going to jump. So there's a real sort of disincentive sometimes to train workers, and yet if you can't find them, you've got to train them. So you can do that through more apprenticeships, which, you know, it's sort of an old-fashioned word, and it brings back really ugly connotations of you know, sort of indentured servitude. But what it really should mean is finding ways to bring people in, perhaps at a subsidized wage or in some way, so that they can learn the skill and then become more productive for whomever they're working. So that's one part. Community colleges can also be that. I think there's a lot of talk, I'm sure here and elsewhere, about, you know, how many more, in one sense, you know, how many more liberal arts grads do we really need? But we need people who graduate from college or some sort of post-secondary education with some skills and some ability, and community colleges can be a way to do that as well. The OECD finds that about 10% of US jobs are at the risk of automation. The World Economic Forum suggests that 6 out of 10 employees are going to need training in the next 5 years because things are just changing and developing so quickly. So this is going to be critical for Mexico and for the US and for, I would venture, everywhere. Tripartite collaboration, and there I don't mean trinational. I literally mean tripartite. I mean industry, government, and academia. Because you have to make sure that the courses that are taught at a place like TAMIU are actually generating people with the skills that the business community wants. The government can be involved as well. It can be in terms of supporting that, whether it's subsidizing the courses or making more generous grants to universities like this one so that they can offer the training, or just sort of facilitating the conversations between academia and the private sector. And there are some good examples of that. Of that collaboration. For example, Arizona State University launched an English for Semiconductors course, and they developed it by talking to industry and talking to experts in teaching about how do you teach people. It's not to teach them how semiconductors work, it's to teach them how to talk about it in English, because English is the lingua franca of the semiconductor industry. So how do you make sure that an engineer working here or working in Mexico can communicate with somebody in Topeka about their semiconductor production? So that's one example. Another good one is the state of Guanajuato in Mexico, which through its State Training Institute collaborates actively with the private sector to figure out, okay, what do you need? What kinds of skills are you looking to hire? What kinds of courses would we need those people to take in order to be good potential employees for you? Schneider Electric, which is very active here in the border region, recently launched an innovation training center in Mexico City. Same idea of trying to find ways to help upskill the workers so that they can be productive in this new economy. There's also, when I said tripartite, I didn't mean trinational. There is actually some trinational and binational cooperation as well. Semiconductors in particular is a focus of the U.S.-Mexico high-level economic dialogue and of the North American Leaders Summit. In both cases, the three governments recognizing that doing all the things I mentioned does require some government support, and it really is essential to further development. So let me move on to infrastructure. And I know standing here in Laredo, and all of you, when you think about infrastructure, you think about the border, and you should, and bridges and border crossing, but there's more to it than that. First of all, it's important to remember that infrastructure is not only about the border, and in fact the needs in northern and southern Mexico are really quite different. And so the next president is going to have to think about that and take that into account. The map there, even though it's in a sense sideways, this is actually the narrowest point of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is southern Mexico. And one of the projects, AMLO had 4 big infrastructure projects, which some derisively call his pharaonic projects. The Mexico City Airport, the Mayan Train in the Yucatan Peninsula, the Dos Bocas refinery, and this transoceanic corridor. This is the one I think it gets the least amount of attention, but I think it's actually the one that could have the greatest impact long-term on Mexico and frankly on North America. What it does is it creates an alternative to the Panama Canal, not a replacement. But as you might be aware, because of drought conditions, the Panama Canal has been limiting the size of ships that can go through. So this presents another way to get from Asia to the Atlantic, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, or up to the east coast of the U.S. So I think it's a really great opportunity. They created, as you see there, some tax incentives to encourage investment. And one of the things about the project that I think is really valuable is the idea is not simply to build a rail line and a bunch of warehouses, but the idea is that there'd actually be value add. There'd be some additive production in southern Mexico, which is the poorest part of the country. It was one of the things that, as I said, that AMLO focused on. And it's really, I think, a great opportunity to further to promote integration within Mexico, sort of get away from, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, the two Mexicos, which McKinsey coined maybe a decade ago, about how northern Mexico and parts of central Mexico were growing and were increasingly affluent, and then you had other parts of Mexico that were getting left behind. So this would be a way to address that. So that's one piece of infrastructure, and I'm going to talk about, in the context of energy, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Another infrastructure issue that, again, maybe you don't think about when we think about infrastructure, relates to water. About a little more than 40% of Mexicans, believe it or not, don't have constant access to potable water. The south of Mexico is 25% of the population, but it's about 2/3 of the water. The north is the other way around. So as I know you all know, in northern Mexico, there are some serious drought issues. In southern Mexico, there's plenty of water, but there's kind of no one using it, or they haven't sort of connected it in a way that it can be used, because obviously moving the water is not what we're talking about. By 2050, demand for food production in Mexico is projected to go up by about 70%, and that's going to require an increase in available water of 55%, and that's not possible. You can't really get more water, right? And there's a water cycle. It falls, it gets recycled, but you can't kind of make more. And there are a bunch of reasons why Mexico is suffering from, due to climate change, is suffering all these shortages and deficits. And again, we know this in the Southwest U.S. as well. One of the stressors on the water system is urbanization, right? There are just more people moving to the cities. It puts more strain on municipal water, both access to the water and then the movement of the water and the infrastructure. There are severe infrastructure limitations because there hasn't been enough investment in Mexico's water infrastructure. You may be aware that Mexico City is now suffering pretty severe water shortages. Unfortunately, the infrastructure has been so poorly maintained that they estimate that about 40% of the water that goes through the pipes doesn't actually get to customers or consumers. It gets lost through leaks and cracks in the pipes, et cetera. And then, of course, because of poor urban planning, and this, I think we're guilty of this in the United States too. Nobody really ever thought about, well, we won't run out of water, so, you have too much concrete, and then you don't get water absorption, you get runoff, it's sort of uncontrolled runoff in a big storm. And I think increasingly people are looking at that. I live in Arlington County, Virginia, and there are now provisions about what you pay on your water bill depends sort of on how much grass you have versus how much pavement you have on your property. I haven't quite figured out how I convince them or tell them what we have, but just to suggest that this is not, again, something unique to Mexico or Mexico City, but it is an important challenge for the next president to look at water. Another piece, and this will tie to energy, is the fact that Mexico has huge lithium deposits in northwestern Mexico. It happens to be the driest part of Mexico. Lithium extraction is incredibly water intensive. So the next president of Mexico, whomever it is going to basically have to make some decisions. I mentioned the need for more water for agriculture, but if you want to shift some of that water to lithium, and there's obviously a great incentive to do that, you've got to make some choices. You have to make policy decisions about how are you going to use the water, who gets to make the decisions, et cetera. So I do know I'm in Laredo, and I wasn't going to ignore the northern border, so don't worry about that. You all know how much truck traffic has increased here over the past few years. I think it was 5 million crossings total last year, if I have that data correctly. My friend and your colleague, Daniel Covarrubias at the Texas Center has done a lot of work in these issues, which I've cited in our book and we've used in other places as well. But I think in addition to, so we know there's the issues of truck crossing and additional lanes and bridges, but I think what we need is for the two governments, first of all, to develop infrastructure jointly. It doesn't do any good for us to improve sort of half of a bridge or the crossing only on one side. It's got to be coordinated, and there are resource limitations, so making sure the two governments really think through where do we get the biggest bang for the buck, whether it's building a new bridge or a new lane or or using technology to improve the efficiency of borders so that things cross more quickly. And this is something that CBP is very focused on, more non-invasive inspection mechanisms with low-level radiation so that they can see what's in a truck or get a sense of what's in a truck without it necessarily having to always stop. This is something, the first time I came to Laredo, which was 20-odd years ago, CBP showed us how they were doing that with trains, with freight cars in those days, using higher levels of radiation because there were at least not supposed to be any people in them. But it's these kind of technologies that can allow you to get more stuff across the border without building, additional lanes or additional bridges. So those are all things that obviously have to be done together. You've got to make sure that the technology on the U.S. and Mexican side talk to each other. There was at one point rumors that the Mexicans were going to buy some Chinese technology at low cost, and the U.S. essentially said, if you do that, we won't connect. So that too is important. And then, the last thing I mentioned sort of on infrastructure is the idea that different products require different infrastructure. So the idea of perhaps building cold storage facilities, for example, for produce, so that while it's waiting to be inspected, it doesn't continue to deteriorate. Produce, fruits and vegetables, certainly one of the great successes of NAFTA and USMCA. It's why we have fresh vegetables year-round wherever we are in the country. So let me try to go a little quicker here. Security is another factor, and I hope you can see the slide. So let me just highlight that there are increasing concerns about hijacking of trucks, about movement of goods around Mexico. About 14 drivers were killed in the first 6 months of 2024. Obviously, huge numbers of hijackings every day. And if you're planning to build a factory and produce stuff, you've got to be able to get it to your customers. And if you're worried that a certain percent of your trucks aren't going to make it, then that's going to factor into your decision of whether to invest or not. Most of the hijackings don't occur in the border area. It's where the production is taking place in Jalisco, Guanajuato, state of Mexico, et cetera. We had a visit by the governor of Yucatan to the Wilson Center several months ago, and he talked about how they had done a great job of reducing or eliminating hijacking in the state of Yucatan. But the problem was what happened when something was shipped from Yucatan to Veracruz to a port or something and then got hijacked. So that was a big concern. Extortion is an increasing concern in Mexico, and this is extortion, everything from, protection money for somebody, just a small vendor, to big companies having to, being extorted. The Mexican Senate's think tank thinks or suggests there could be 13,000 examples of extortion every day. So that would be everything from the little tiny to the huge. The Global Organized Crime Index puts Mexico #1 for extortion, not one being bad, not good. So there are some real concerns. And then in terms of workforce security, if you have built a new factory or expanded a factory and you want to bring a new GM, maybe from your company, somewhere else in your company, that person may not want to move to a place that they consider unsafe for themselves or their family or their workers. So all of these, the security situation in Mexico, the safety in Mexico is really important to changing the image. I think even though we perhaps understand that just like in the United States, there are places that are safer or less safe, I think if you're in a boardroom in New York City or Paris or wherever you are, I think those distinctions get lost the further away you are. So if Mexico's perception is that it's dangerous, I think, and I've talked to CEOs about this, if I'm trying to pitch, let's invest more in the country I work in, and I have to spend half of my pitch explaining why it's not as dangerous as they think it is, you've lost compared to maybe the GM from, let's pick another place. So Costa Rica, who can say, oh, everything is great. In Costa Rica, it's a little further, but we don't have any of these problems. So that's an important issue. And then, and I'll do this quickly, the other part of security, I think it's important to think of them as sort of internal and external, are fentanyl and arms trafficking. And I'll just go through this really quickly. I think you're all aware, over 100,000 fentanyl deaths in the United States. Most of it comes through the U.S. through legal ports of entry. It's obviously something that the next Mexican president will have to deal with. And firearms trafficking going south. This is a chart that one of our interns did for us. I've seen figures from Mexico's foreign ministry suggesting it could be that 70% or 70 to 90% of the weapons used in crime in Mexico came from the United States. So clearly this is something that has to be addressed by both countries. Energy I've talked about a little bit because, as I said, everything kind of overlaps. But basically, the reason that energy is important to nearshoring, well, there's a couple reasons, but the one that maybe you're not thinking of is that many multinational companies have made commitments to reduce their emissions globally. So if they're in Mexico getting electricity that is produced by dirty fuel oil, by oil, and particularly dirty oil, or even as opposed to natural gas or renewables, then that makes the cost of production from an emission standpoint, more expensive. And it's got to either be offset by producing an equal amount somewhere where you don't have much environmental impact, or potentially by reducing your production so that you're not creating as many emissions. The other problem, or the other challenge, which is related, of course, is just the reality that if I don't have access to reliable, cost-efficient, and clean energy, I'm not going to be inclined to invest in that market in the first place. So what the next president will have to do is look at or deal with what's known as the energy trilemma, which is energy security, which means being able to have electricity or energy in your country, which is usually addressed through a combination of domestic and foreign production. Energy equity, which is the balance between electricity or energy for commercial use and energy for personal use, also can refer to ensuring that there's access throughout the country equally. And then sustainability, I think you all understand what sustainability is all about. And to get there, Mexico is going to need to return to or allow for the private collaboration, either private investment or public-private partnerships that were envisioned in the 2013 energy reform, which AMLO has largely sought to undo. And this applies to both natural gas and to electricity generation. For natural gas, there are two challenges. One is getting technology to extract the shale gas that exists in northern Mexico, which is, of course, connected to the shale gas in Texas, same geological formation. And that's going to require private sector know-how and private sector capital to do. And then in the southern part of the country, they need to expand the pipeline so they can actually move natural gas to the factories that in theory are going to be created in that transoceanic corridor that I talked about a few minutes ago. And then the other part, renewables. Again, Mexico has huge potential for renewable energy, for solar, for wind, for hydro and thermal, and it hasn't really been fully exploited. The 2013 energy reform did allow for private investment in renewables and for either self-generation, that is generating electricity to power your own factory, or to sell it back to the grid. And those are ways in which you could address that first issue I mentioned about the global emissions commitments, and a way to take advantage of generating electricity in a way that, solar electricity doesn't really cost that much. The sun's kind of there all the time, except on the rare occasion when we have an eclipse, I guess. So those are the four issues, the four areas that seem to need to be addressed in order to capitalize on the nearshoring that I think Mexico pretty clearly wants to do. And I'll just mention that both candidates, both Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Galvez, have in fact talked about the importance of attracting nearshoring. It will be interesting to see, depending on which one wins, how they'll go about doing it. But I don't think there's really any question that the two women who are likely to be the next president, they both understand why nearshoring matters for Mexico. But in a few minutes, because this is a trade conference and because, as was mentioned in my bio, I worked on NAFTA and USMCA for a really long time, I thought I would just share a couple thoughts on USMCA, and then I'm happy to have some questions and conversation. So in the interest of time, let me skip that. I think most of you know a fair amount about USMCA, or happy to share the slides for those of you who want to know more. In the 3 years that USMCA has existed, trade is up almost another 30%. which is pretty stunning when you consider how much it had grown. I'm sure you've all seen sort of those classic graphs that show trade in 1994 to 2021 when, and then onward into USMCA. Mexico and Canada are back to being our top trading partners. Mexico passed China last year for the first time since 2001, which was the year after China entered the WTO. And again, I can skip this. I think you all know this, just how important Mexico is to the United States in terms of trade. And I think this is actually, I will pause for a second to say, I don't think most Americans understand, I think all of you probably do, but most Americans don't understand how important Mexico is for our economy. Mexico is, or the U.S. is obviously, I think more obviously, incredibly important to the Mexican economy because of how much of their exports come here. U.S. trade deficit with Mexico has never been larger, and that is potentially relevant, particularly depending on the outcome of our election in November. So what I want to just spend a couple minutes on, because I think to me this is really, really interesting and I hope relevant to you, is the 2026 Review Conference. The USMCA, one of the unique features that USMCA included was a review conference, a recognition that one of the things that was, I think nobody disagreed with, is that NAFTA was 25 years old and a lot of things were different. In 1994 we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have cell phones is that's a good enough example. Many of you weren't even alive in 1994, so there's another example. So in 2026, the three countries will meet to discuss whether to extend the agreement for 16 more years or to agree that there are some issues that still need to be addressed, and if so, they will meet again the following year. And that can happen for up to 10 years. So USMCA, if nobody does anything, USMCA ends in 2036. At any time, it could be extended for 16 years. I think it's more likely that in 2026, there'll be an agreement that, okay, we need to fix some things and we're going to continue to talk about it. I think it's probably unlikely. But again, depends on who wins in our country that there'd be a commitment to do another 16. But the whole point is to try to create some certainty for the business community and also have the opportunity to address challenges. So there's a couple things that I think will come up in the review conference that are relevant. One is there are a number of disputes, currently disputes or potential disputes under the agreement. Auto rules of origin is one where Mexico and Canada successfully argued that the U.S. interpretation of the rules of origin for autos was incorrect. Mexico and Canada have not insisted that the U.S. comply, nor have they applied the penalties that they would be entitled to apply. The next one is GMO corn. Mexico has proposed to ban the import of genetically modified corn, arguing without much basis in fact that it's not safe. We all eat, and all our animals eat GMO corn. But this is a case where the U.S. only reluctantly, after a lot of pressure from the ag sector, started the process of bringing dispute settlement, but has not pushed it to conclusion. And the third, maybe the most famous, is energy, where AMLO's policies pretty clearly violate USMCA, and the U.S. has not even sought a formal dispute settlement case yet. The concern, or I think the sense on all of those, on the latter two, is because the U.S. needs help from Mexico on fentanyl and migration, they're not going to push AMLO, particularly not on energy, which is his baby. It's really the sort of sacred cow for López Obrador. But I think, in my view, the problem with not implementing the agreement fully, if you lose a dispute, not changing your practice, and if you see a dispute, not pursuing it, is it undermines credibility in the agreement. Why should I support an agreement that doesn't actually do all the stuff it's supposed to do or doesn't solve the issue? So to me, I think it's critically important that the U.S. and Canada and Mexico actually implement even the parts of the agreement they don't like. So in Mexico, that means you can't change your energy rules in ways that violate the agreement. In the U.S., it means you can't unilaterally decide that what you think you agreed in the agreement is what the agreement says. The other factor, and this is maybe in a sense a bigger one, is China in a number of ways. One is you're seeing increasing investment from China in Mexico. Lots more production of parts, for auto parts, for example. But BYD, which is China's largest EV producer, has also announced plans to build a factory in Mexico somewhere to produce for the Mexican market. They would presumably, the reason the Chinese companies are investing in Mexico is to get to our market around the tariffs that I mentioned earlier. So they want to produce in Mexico, make the required changes under the terms of the agreement so that they can sell as a North American or a Mexican product, not a Chinese product. President Trump has said that if he is elected, he will put 100% tariff on Chinese EVs so that they can't come into the United States. Among other things, that would be a violation of USMCA. I mentioned Mexico's our trade deficit with Mexico is growing. And if you remember, I earlier pointed out that Trump had been very focused on the trade deficit with China. I don't think it's impossible to believe that he would have the same concern about Mexico. What that means for the review of USMCA, it's hard to say. But I think it is definitely a factor that will come out in the conversation somewhere. And the last thing to mention is stakeholder engagement. There is an obligation on the part of all three countries to engage with their stakeholders and then to report to Congress 180 days before they begin the actual review on what the plans are. Since USMCA's birthday is July 1st, I would guess by January 1st of 2026, that report will have to take place. So there will be opportunities for all of us in this room, online, everywhere else, to engage. It's not clear exactly how whichever administration it is in the U.S. will do it, but it will be an opportunity, and I know a lot of you here know a lot and have strong views about USMCA and how it is or isn't working, and it'll be really important that you take those advantages, those opportunities to engage so that what we get, at least I think what most of us want, certainly what I think would be right, is we do want a strengthened USMCA. We want to fix any issues that may be outstanding, but we certainly don't want to go back to a situation that we had when there was a threat that NAFTA would be replaced with nothing, and then we would lose all the advantages we get from North American free trade. So I will stop there, and happy to take questions on any or all of that.
So there are microphones around, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring microphones to you. So there's one there. We also have questions online as well, and so I will read those out when after the questions have been
Excellent.
asked.
Michael Yoder, do you see a difference between, say, Claudia versus AMLO, and also Xochitl in regards to the privatization of the energy part? In other words, is anybody talking in the campaign about moving back to a kind of Peña Nieto arrangement in terms of foreign participation in the energy sector?
That's a good question for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, one of the things that I guess maybe I didn't mention is I think to the answer, what's Claudia going to do? I don't think we exactly know what Claudia will do. She is, as I said, she's running essentially as the incumbent. She is being backed by an incredibly charismatic current president who doesn't really accept much diversion. So I think she's playing it smart by not really saying much. And what she says is 100% aligned with the 4T. I don't think we know for sure, and it may depend on whether the opposition is able to prevent Morena from having a two-thirds majority in Congress. With a two-thirds majority, they implement constitutional reforms that will further hamstring Claudia or Xochitl. Xochitl definitely envisions going back to that Peña Nieto situation where you would allow public-private partnerships and recognize that you need to take advantage of private sector know-how.
We have questions over here.
With Killam Oil Company. We actually sell natural gas into Mexico and through the Howard line into Monterey area. And I'm also friends with groups out of San Antonio that have done oil and gas exploration in Mexico. And just want to get your, maybe you expand on some of the energy policy aspects. And also if you think that, at least from my perspective, that I think there's going to be a need for additional energy integration in Texas or U.S. and Mexico, given that industrial relations could be happening there, investment, as well as there will be, as you kind of touched on the kind of technology side of it, which I think, although it touches all the different categories that you mentioned, I do think in a way it's its own, and there will be data centers there and other things that have immense electricity. So if you like to sort of open-ended question on just sort of what your thoughts are about kind of energy policy. Do you think that the aspects around renewables will hamper investment in some way, or is there going to be a more sort of pragmatic approach?
So again, good question. I think on the interconnectedness, which is a shorter, I think a shorter part of the question and a quicker answer. Yeah, we do need to have better interconnection of our grids. If you look at a map of the interconnection of the U.S.-Canada grid versus the U.S.-Mexico grid, they're not even close. The one place where there's good integration in the U.S. between the U.S. and Mexico is California and Baja California. But the Baja California grid is not connected to the rest of the Mexican grid. So absolutely agree with you, there needs to be more. I'm not going to pretend to understand ERCOT here in Texas, but I do understand that that is part of the impediment, and somebody can explain to me if that's true or how. In terms of development in Mexico, that's one of the sort of wild cards about Claudia, because everyone sort of assumes, and I don't know this isn't true, but everyone assumes that because she is so committed to and understands climate change that she would see the need for renewable energy. What I think is less, so I think that's pretty certain. Where I think it isn't as clear is how much of that would she be comfortable with, how much of would she be comfortable with private sector development of renewables, or will she continue to maintain one of the policies that AMLO did get through is that CFE, the state electricity company, has to be responsible for 54% of the generation. And so far she said she would support that. So if that's the case and CFE is woefully under-resourced and doesn't have technical capacity, but they get 54%, that essentially puts a cap on how much you can have altogether. So I think there's still a lot of unknowns, but I agree with you entirely that there is going to be a need to generate more electricity. Mexico has gotten some investment in data centers and obviously wants more, but there's some reason we do and everybody wants them. So I think you're right, and it is less clear to me if Claudia wins how that plays out. If Xochitl wins, I think she would essentially go back to the 2013 provisions, maybe with some updates and corrections, but there'd be much more, I think, willingness to see private investment. And there has been some. It hasn't been completely non-existent in Mexico, but the potential far exceeds what's been accomplished.
Howdy, my name is Andrew. Thank you for coming down to Laredo. I'm a real estate developer here. I was in Mexico City a few weeks ago with NASCO for our annual legislative trip there. And the two topics of conversation that came up and everything was China, and the answers were pretty obtuse. And then the second point was the military. Pretty much half the questions we'd asked at the SRE were, well, we're interested in that, but that's a military concern. The interoceanic corridor, we'd love to tell you more about that, but the military hasn't shared that with us. What is the military's effect on the election that's coming up with their vastly expanded powers in the last 6 years under AMLO's administration?
That's a good question, Tocayo, and I'm not sure I know exactly what the military's impact is going to be on the election. They have a far greater impact on the economy than they ever have before. And that obviously raises a lot of concerns. You know, the armed forces were always considered one of the most respected institutions in Mexico. There was a sense, particularly with some parts of the military, that there wasn't a lot of corruption. And I always think, well, maybe they weren't corrupt because there was nothing to be corrupt about. There was no access to money. When you start running railroads and airports and ports and building trains, the opportunities for bad actors to profit grow. So I think there are some really legitimate questions and concerns about the role of the military. I don't know how that plays out in the election itself. The one wild card, and I really hope, say this because you asked, I don't know how likely it is, but in the event it's a really close election and one side or the other doesn't accept the outcome, whether the military wouldn't get involved, that I don't know, but I think that's in terms of military and election, it seems to me that's the place that that something could happen.
I think we had another question over here.
What do you think would be the influence on Laredo, if you have an opinion on this, on the recent acquisition by Canadian Pacific of Kansas City Southern, the railroads?
I know it happened, and honestly, I'm not trying to duck the question. I don't feel like I understand rail business well enough to give you a fair answer to that.
We have a question here.
What we could expect in terms of educational reforms, because the current president has cut down, they've changed the National Council to Science and Technology. There's a lot of cut funding for higher education. So what we could see in terms of educational reforms with
again, I think the answers are almost always the same in that it's not clear what Claudia would do. Her background would suggest an appreciation for innovation and for science and tech, but her statements that she is fully going to pursue the policies of Lopez Obrador would be counter to that, because as you rightly point out, they have cut back on funding for CONACYT. They really have seemed to take an approach that, sort of free thought and independent research is dangerous. Xochitl Galvez has talked about the need for more innovation. And, I don't know specifically, I don't believe she said, I will change funding by X or Y amount, but I think you would, again, see more of that traditional awareness and appreciation for the need for innovation in Mexico. So, again, I think on a lot of these, we don't know where Claudia would be if she does what she said publicly, then you wouldn't see a change from AMLO. If Xochitl wins, you would definitely see a change.
Thank you. We have a question from online. The Mexican peso has been appreciating versus the US dollar. Do you believe this will play a significant role in investments in the two countries?
Well, I know, and talking to folks in the private sector, they're suffering. We have an ag labor project, and I was talking to folks in that industry in Mexico a couple weeks ago, and that's having the exchange rate is having an impact. And what's happening is you've got a strong peso, you've got high interest rates. The one thing that business can try to control is labor costs, and that's leading to downward pressure on wages and moving people into the informal sector, all of which are negative. I think the strength of the peso is generally attributed to the flows of investment, the $36 billion investment, not to mention all the remittances. Mexico is now the second highest recipient of remittances from the U.S. after only India. And then, of course, there's money coming back into the system from illicit trade as well.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the room here? Oh, we have one at the back.
Hello. I have a quick question. Do you see any effect, any change on Mexico's public debt, and what is the effect into Pemex? If it's is the future of this company?
Yeah. So Pemex is the most indebted oil company in the world, and this administration has pumped $90 billion into Pemex, which is more than Venezuela's GDP. So that's my little factoid to share on that. I think, again, whether this happens depends on who wins, but I think, the Mexican government cannot continue to prop up Pemex the way it has been. Pemex at one point was a the overwhelming share of government revenues. That's decreased considerably. It's not what it used to be in terms of keeping the Mexican state afloat. But I think it is going to saddle the next president with a lot of debt and a lot of obligations. And again, if you think about, or if it's a Claudia Sheinbaum administration, will she make the changes that would be necessary, whether it's allowing or encouraging Pemex to do more with the private sector so that it can actually extract oil, deep water oil, which it doesn't really have the capacity to do. And while I know we talked a lot about natural gas and sustainability and renewables, that the energy transition is not happening tomorrow, so we are going to continue to need fossil fuels. Pemex needs to stop venting as much as they do. So I mean, there's a lot of technical challenges that they're not up to. I think the smart thing would be to take advantage of the private sector's experience. It seems to me that sometimes people confuse ownership with the work. If you could hire me, to teach a class here at TAMIU, and maybe I'm not wearing a TAMIU shirt, but the benefits still accrue to TAMIU. Maybe that's not a great example, but I think AMLO seems to have the view that if the oil isn't taken out of the ground by somebody wearing a Pemex logo on their shirt, it doesn't belong to Mexico. And that's not true. You can have a contract that says, I will pay, I'll pay Andrew to extract the oil, but I get it, or I decide what to do with it. And I think there's not enough of, I think they confuse, who's extracting it with who owns it, and they need to change that.
We have another question down here, and then we have one more over there.
Yes, thank you for coming to Laredo. This is Rafael. And my question to you is, if you were elected the next Mexico president, how would you tackle security?
Oh, well, that's not going to happen. What's that famous, if nominated, I won't accept, and if elected, I won't serve. Look, security is really complicated, and I'm not going to pretend that I could give you a short answer. I think, I will say that I think this administration's desire to reduce violence, the hugs not bullets strategy, was clearly too far to the extreme, and that the involvement of the cartels, the violence surrounding the election, the number of candidates who've already been assassinated, the continued flows of fentanyl. I think what would be required is a long-term strategy. I mean, I think AMLO was not wrong in that you've got to create opportunities so that people don't feel that working for the cartels is the only choice. But you also need more enforcement. I think you've got to take a harder stand, and what it seems has largely happened is the approach has been, don't mess with us and we'll leave you alone. And that works, except when it doesn't, right? When innocent people wind up, getting shot. So I think, look, like I said, I can't give you, I don't have a security plan for Mexico. I think you need more cooperation with the United States, not necessarily perhaps led by or only with DEA, but I think you actually need to start with a common definition of what the problem is. And at the moment, AMLO goes back and forth, but frequently says there is no fentanyl problem in Mexico. Nobody's using fentanyl in Mexico, and while there's less than there is here, that's just not right. So if you and I can't even agree on what the problem is, we're never going to come up with a strategy. And I think, so that's probably the first step, is let's have a diagnosis of what's happening, and then how do we address it.
I think after this we'll have time for one more question. So if you have a question that's burning, keep that in mind.
Okay, I'll try to make it a short answer.
I'm retired, I have time to read, and I have time to study. And it's my opinion that the United States does not appreciate what they have south of the border. In respect, for example, World War II. World War II almost became to odds with Mexico. Almost happened. But two presidents, President Avila Camacho, President Franklin Roosevelt, were friends. They sat down, they talked, and they released manpower to the United States to remove our problem with manpower. Mm-hmm. Mexico released resources. Japan was sinking our ships. We didn't have the resources. They had it south of the border. So all they did was bring it across the border, the ships and so on and so forth. It was the cooperation between the two presidents, the friendship that they had, that they overcome the Bracero problem, the other problems that were coming on, and the United States succeeded in the war. They did not, they built forts all along the river, the border, in case they didn't need them, because of the friendship and the acceptance of the two peoples. This is why the Spanish surnames are so prevalent in central United States. Go to Chicago, they're all over. They're everywhere. So I don't think that the United States understands what they have south of the border. Manpower, resources, intelligence, everything. That's my personal opinion.
No, I agree with you entirely. We talk about that all the time, that we need to, that people in the U.S. don't appreciate how reliant we are and how interconnected our societies are. I mean, at the Wilson Center, we always say there is no relationship, no bilateral relationship that has a bigger impact on the lives of Americans than the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So you're 100%.
So I think we have time for one more question if anyone has a question. If not, I will want to thank Mr. Rodman for an excellent talk and a good Q&A session.
Great, thank you. Oh my gosh.
And we want to present you with this is
Wow.
a TAMIU globe. So
Thank you.
we want to present this with you
Wow.
to take back to Washington, D.C.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Before everyone else leaves, I do want to thank the people who make this conference possible, and in particular the people, I want to thank IBC Banks and Commerce Banks for the support of this luncheon. I also want to thank some of the people who have helped with the running of the conference, especially those our staff members in the Western Hemispheric Trade Center. So in particular, I'd like to thank Amy Palacios, who's the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Western Hemispheric Trade, who has managed the entire conference. And I also want to thank Jessica Cavazos and Jasmine Spear, and our student workers, Andrea Martinez-Dominguez and Daniela Rangel. These people are what ensures this runs well and keeps going and everything doesn't fall apart and you get food on your table and the microphones work and these kind of things. In addition to the staff at the Western Hemisphere Trade Center, we get a lot of help from other people too to run the conference, and I want to thank those people as well. I want to thank our staff in the A.R. Sanchez School of Business who generously lend time to come and help us with the organizational things. I want to thank the members of the Dean's Student Advisory Council who carry around the microphones and help in that way. And of course, I want to thank OIT. If OIT weren't doing this, we wouldn't be able to have everything working as well. And Event Services for the excellent food that we've got in front of us. So finally, I want to thank you all for coming. Having a good audience is what makes these kind of lunches a success. So thank you all for coming, and I hope that you'll attend other parts of the conference as the next day and a half goes on. So thank you.